Good morning, my friends. We are ready with another class. This class, I'll be dealing with the concept of Mother India. Now, Mother India as a text is there in your to watch films. Mother India, directed by Mehboob Khan, and one of the most iconic films in the early Indian cinema, and which we will look at in deep in the next class. But today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to place before you the conceptualization of the terminology Mother India itself. Now, before getting into the film, the historicity of this term is important to analyze here. Mother India as a concept, as a nationalist discourse, as an imagination of the nation as a mother, precedes the movie, of course. There was already a strong connotation of the mother figure to the nation figure. I would go on as well to suggest that the worshipping of the mother figure is almost a sacrosanct idea which was just replicated by the nationalist leaders, by the nationalist movements in the early years of the Indian national movement. Thus, if we find that there have been quite a few references to the concept of Mother India early. The first few references to Mother India is found in the works of, as you would all know, the famous song called Bande Mataram, which hails the mother as a nation. And there have also been, during the partition of Bengal, if you remember, in 1905, please go through that chapter in history, the partition of Bengal, which is very, very important for our understanding. The partition of Bengal is important because we see for the first time the use of the term Bongo Mata. The term that was used was Bongo Mata. Now, Bongo Mata as a concept was liberally used by the nationalists from Bengal, and from there this caught on the imagination of the nationalist leaders, and it kept on, and then we find Bande Mataram and all other such songs which kept coming in, which venerated the concept of the nation, the concept of the free nation as something mother, a sacrosanct image, an image of where the mother would represent our whole idea of the nation. Now, as we go forward, the concept of Mother India and the refashioning of Mother India starts to happen around somewhere in 1927. Now, this is what is very important and where I will start the class, my today's class. A US based journalist, an American journalist, Catherine Mayo. Catherine Mayo was a journalist who would be working for the US press, for the American press, and she was working in different locations at different points in time. She went on to Philippines to work with the US Army there and wrote a book there. Then she turns her attention to India and the British colonial empire in India, and she writes this now very infamous book, and the book was very interestingly titled Mother India. Now, Mother India, this book, now from now on I will be referring to Mother India as the book itself. So, Catherine Mayo's Mother India is an interesting title. What she does in this book is she depicts in very horrific details the horrors in which the Indian mother was subject during the childbirth. Now, this is something which is not unknown to us. So, she picked up the issue of health and hygiene and disease to further her cause of writing this book. Now, what she does interesting is her title itself was a comparison to this popular nationalist iconography. So she knew very well that the concept of Mother India was a very venerated idea, an iconography which was sacred to the Indians and to the nationalist leaders, to the peoples who fought for the freedom of this country. She knew this idea, and this use of this very same word to talk about the ills that afflicted Indian society, Indian women. So she was writing about the position of Indian women, and she was comparing it to the concept of Mother India herself. So she was striking down two enemies with one bullet, and this was a deliberate attempt to awaken the woman by contrasting their actual treatment of women with the glorification. So there was this problem with the representation of women in the Indian minds. On the one hand, you had this Mother India concept, on the other hand, you had the actual situation of the Indian women. And considering the times 1927, we understand that Catherine Mayo had very carefully chosen her topic. So this becomes a very hotly debated and very a catalyst for a lot of debate and struggle within the Indian society. The Indian nationalist movement itself was suffering from a lack of leadership and other such things, and thus it was being struck by one of the colonial agendas. And Catherine Mayo's book, as we will see in later, is a perfect example of the colonial agenda to strike down Indian nationalist movement. Okay, so the book then, because of its very nature of striking at the weakest points of the Indian society, becomes an agent for debate, struggle, revitalization of the whole movement and the whole women's question in India. And thus we see what is projected in this timeline is the women's question in India, the larger Indian nationalist story. The women's question in the larger nationalist agenda, in the larger nationalist discourse, was never taken such seriously, never taken independently of the national agenda, and thus this becomes an important debating issue. And thus so the nationalist refashioning of Mother India, mediated specifically through a new discourse of Indian feminism, was what was going to be the outcome of all the struggles and debates that I am talking about. Now Spivak, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, had argued in one of her books that the voice of the colonized female is lost between the object constitution of imperialism. Now understand this carefully, between the object constitution of imperialism, marked by the espousal of the woman as object of protection from our own kind, and the subject constitution of patriarchal nationalism, which apparently grants the woman free choice as a subject. Now, if you understand the position of women during the freedom struggle in India, the women's cause is one cause which the Britishers have always argued to be one of their mottos. They were the harbingers of modernity to the Indian society. They were the agents of change. They would like to call themselves as the agents of change. And this is how they would argue about the need for a colonial rule, of a civilized colonial rule. And thus the position of women in India always oscillated between this colonial endeavor to bring modernity and change and education on the one hand, which is the object constitution of imperialism. So the woman was being projected by the British as who needs protection, as who needs change, while on the other hand there is the subject constitution of the women as part of a patriarchal nationalism. And this part of the patriarchal nationalism is the woman is seen as a subject who needs also freedom, and the woman is a free subject under this patriarchal nationalist agenda. So the woman oscillates between these two identities of the object constitution and the subject constitution. And this is what Spivak had argued. And so this is where feminism, let's say, if we might call it feminism, early feminism oscillated between before Catherine Mayo happened. Yet by 1920s, both the colonial and male nationalist constructs of colonized female, a so-called authentic voice of modern Indo womanhood, had emerged. So now by 1920s, the rise of the woman's voice had started to emerge slowly but surely. We started seeing women leaders coming into the forefront. Of course, we started seeing women in professions. We started seeing women getting education. We started seeing women going to the professional fields, and we started looking at a very of course a few select urban elite female, western educated female, and but slowly and surely between these two constructs of the colonial and the male nationalist, the colonized female also started to come up with a voice of her own. The Indian womanhood had started to emerge. We might not call that as a liberal feminist voice, but at least a voice had started to emerge by the 1920s. Okay, so women like Sarojini Naidu and all became part of the Congress party and became very important senior leaders in that party. So Partha Chatterjee, in one of his books, had argued a very important point, that the debates about the representation of Indian women actually was a very central and a fundamental problem of national identity. Now let me put it in this way. See, the reforms of the woman's position, the reform, of course there was reforms needed, the reforms of the woman's position and the creation of this new woman was fast becoming part of the legitimate nationalist preoccupation. There was a slow realization that without reforms in the status of women in India, be it education, be it child marriage, be it widow remarriage, without the reform in the status of women, the nationalist agenda could not go forward. So the question of nationalist discourse had inherited this question of the woman, but it was still subsumed under the nationalist agenda. It was almost like a nationalist patriarchy that was talking, that was saying that okay, woman be woman, but it's the nationalist patriarchal voice which will provide you with the emancipatory voice of reform. So the identification of the women's struggle with the national struggle also, and this was during the time that Gandhi was also starting to become part of the nationalist movement, that there were some of these slogans that were being coined, which clearly shows that the women's question was fast becoming an important question in this struggle. So slogans such as India cannot be free until its women are free, and women cannot be free until India is free. So the women's question is merged with the larger question of self-rule. So women can only be free if India is free. So we see a very strong nationalist patriarchy at work during these moments of Indian history, and Chatterjee's work actually shows how the question of the Indian woman was merged with this. So during the early 20s and the late 20s, the question of India's woman, of course, was seen as part of the larger debate of the Indian question. Hence, you see what happens is, because of this mergers of this women's question, orthodox indigenous patriarchy, which still formed actually a large context of the Indian question, was to be replaced by the nationalist patriarchy. So there was this subtle change from an indigenous orthodox patriarchy to a nationalist patriarchy, a new nationalist patriarchy where the women's question is included. So in which women's emancipation would be discussed, which will dictate some of this discourse. So very conveniently we see Indian feminism, early Indian feminism was already at work during this period. Early Indian feminism made changes to the way the national patriarchy worked. So the orthodox indigenous patriarchies would be slowly and calmly replaced by this sort of a patriarchy, which was more nationalist in a manner, where the women would be given a position side by side to nationalist leaders, male nationalist leaders, and thus we see the women's question being raised by people such as Nehru and Gandhi, and such liberal leaders who would not be problematized with the women's question, and rather they would take the women's question along with the question of the Indian state or the Indian idea of self-rule. Thus we see there are a lot of going forward, there is a lot of progress in the way Indian feminism happened during this period. So it was surely surely it was one of those questions that remained at the heart of the Indian question. Now we might then say that the women's question has been one of the most important questions which could not be ignored during this period. So women's own agency cannot be overlooked. That's the point that I was making in the success of the entire nationalist project. Now what happens with the coming of Mayo's Mother India, Catherine Mayo's Mother India, the book? It provided one arena for examination of the historical condition under which certain sections of women in India learned to ratify the nationalist imagining of India. Now I'll explain this to you in brief. The question of the woman in India was again put forth in the limelight after Mayo's Mother India was published. The women's question was again brought to the center of the nationalist agenda. No longer could you ignore the question of the women, because Catherine Mayo had actually criticized the nationalist patriarchy by questioning the condition of the Indian women. How could India win freedom? How could India rule herself? How could Indian leaders think of a free India when its own women is treated in such a horrific manner? So many Indian women were dying at childbirth. Indian women did not have the right to remarry after widowhood. Indian women were married off as child brides. All these questions were valid, probably valid questions that Mayo was raising, which put all the limelight into the nationalist movement. Now, although Mayo's arguments were valid, but some of the statistics that she provided in the book were horribly way off the mark. Because Mayo's whole agenda was not innocent. They were not misguided, they were not innocent, but rather she was actually nothing but a stooge in the hands of the British imperial government. She was brought in by the British, she was helped by the colonial rulers to write this thesis. This was part of the whole propaganda machinery of the British colonial empire. Now, why would the British do this? We will look at it. But when Mayo releases her book, we'll look at the earlier issue later in the later slide. But when Mayo releases a book, it catches the fancy of the Western world. It becomes a very important talking point in the whole Western hemisphere, from England to America. This was a talking point. This actually showed the British colonial empire in a very positive light, because it was, after all, the British as an agent of change, the Britishers as the emancipator of the woman's position, that they legitimized their presence in India. They legitimized colonial rule. They were the harbingers of modernity. They were the harbingers of civility, of progress, of science. And that's how the British imperial government would like to believe that the role that they were playing. So, the question of modernity, the question of civility, the question of Western education, Western science was what was in question now. Mayo had deliberately shown us, the Indians, that this is where your condition lies. This is what happens to your mothers and daughters. This is now such was the success of this book that almost 20 different books were written on Mayo's book. A dozen more pamphlets were released, and at least one Broadway theatre musical was released in direct response. And many of these books were also written in India, and there were many books that were written by Indian feminists and Indian nationalists in response to Mayo's book. There have been a lot of books that were written against her. For example, there was one book which was written by an Indian lady, where she titles her book Uncle Sham, Sham, directly putting exactly the same questions to the American woman, to the American condition of the American woman, and she puts exactly the same questions. Now, these were some of the ways in which Mayo's criticisms were taken in India. Mother India, this book, focused mainly directly on the Hindu child wives, child marriage was very common during this period, and child mothers. While part 3, 4 and 5 of this book went on to discuss various aspects of the Indian life, like disease, unsanitary conditions, cruelty to animals, untouchability, etc., and all of those things were discussed in this book. Now, what was the role of the imperialists? Imperialists would go on to argue, and very validly, imperialists would go on to argue, the British colonial imperialists, that these were basic justifications, these reforms of these practices were the need of the hour. This was the reason why they were here. This was the reason why Indians needed a civilized colonial rule, why Indians needed education. So the agenda with which Catherine Mayo's Mother India was written was coming to the fore slowly but surely. She was a part of the propaganda machinery in which Mother India focused on. Now, this is not to suggest that there was no, as I had already said, Indian feminism was slowly coming out of the shadows of indigenous orthodox patriarchy before even Mother India was written. So how do you react to such a book? How did the Indian nationalists react to this book? How did the Indian women's movements react to this book? How did the different women's organization react to the book? That's a very important and valid question, because some of these important ideas that Mayo wrote were valid. The criticisms were valid. She was targeting directly against the Hindu traditions of the past. She was talking about the time warp that India was still in, some of the horrific ways in which the Indian mother and daughters were being tortured, while at the same time Indians were in need of independence. So the whole imperial agenda which was coming to the fore after the publication of this book was amply made clear that this book was not a social reformist book. This book was, after all, a political book. It was part of the propaganda machinery. It was a book which was written politically motivated. So this book created a lot of criticism and a lot of arguments from different nationalist leaders. For example, Gandhi had criticized Mayo as an Indophobe and an Anglophile, but at the same time, while he criticizes Mayo, he also says that Indians could nevertheless use Mother India to address some of the problems within Indian society. So he was also aware of some of these questions that Indian women was facing at home. He was aware of some of these social evils, and it's not as if they were not concerned, because Gandhis were this later stage of nationalist patriarchy, where they were the people who brought in the question of women to the Indian National Congress. So the discussion about the women question then in colonial India was actually seldom about women. What was it about? Women were more often the grounds on which competing views of tradition or national identity were debated. Now, on the one hand, you see what happened was, on the one hand, you had this belief of the golden era of the Indian past, the belief of a golden rule, a golden era of the past where everybody was liberated, India was free, and there was a lot of prosperity in the Indian state, in the erstwhile idea of the Indian state, the Hindu way of life, where everything was hunky-dory, everything was good. Now this was in direct opposite to what was happening at the present. Now, while at the one point we were talking about the indigenous patriarchy, was talking about that glorious past to identify that no Indian women were actually always well off, there was this question of the present, of the national identity based on the present, where the women's question was becoming very, very important, because the Indian feminist movement had started to raise its voice in the Indian nationalist agenda. So the Indian feminist voices were becoming more and more vocal about the condition of the Indian woman. The Indian woman was suffering. The Indian woman was, and there we see a very important point that I want to make is, there we see the concept of the Indian liberal feminist slowly arising out of the Indian nationalist agenda. The modern Indian woman, once the signifier of national cultural developments, was now re-articulated in the discourse of liberal feminism. So the citizen of a new nation state, the woman as a citizen of new nation state, needed new ideals. The woman as the citizen of this new nation state would need new ideals, not the glorious past that we were talking about now, which was a hypothetical past, which we don't know whether it existed or not, or whether which we haven't seen, because the present was something which Catherine Mayo and her likes were already talking about, because this past is what was becoming the point on which the imperialist would suggest that the colonial rule was after all good for the Indian state, because it would make you progressive. So the articulation of liberal feminism was becoming very important in the nationalist agenda. Why was it becoming important for the nationalist agenda? We will see. Because you look at the point number 2 here, the passage of Sarda Act, a very important act which was passed by this Indian, and the Sarda Act, which talked about child marriage, which talked about consent of the age consent and all, was the most telling reply by organized Indian women. This is where Indian liberal feminist movement comes into its own. This was fast becoming, because this was a direct response to British rule saying imperial rule is for Indian women. We are trying to bring modernity to the Indian woman. Now you see the duality in this issue. Mayo was suggesting the horrific condition of the Indian woman, and the Britishers were saying, "This is why we are here." When the Indian liberal feminist movement brought about the Sarda Act to the Legislative Assembly, it wasn't passed so easily. There was a lot of fight, there was a lot of protest that needed to take place. Now, the Britishers did not want the act to be passed, interestingly, even though they were saying, citing Mayo and saying, this is why we need to be in India, but they were against this act. Why? Because they did not want to alienate the orthodox Indian conservative male, because this was their whole support base. The conservative Indian was the support base, the conservative male was the support base for the British rule. They were the people who were supporting the Britishers' rule. So the Britishers were not in favor of passing the Sarda Act. So this brought about this duality in the nature of the British colonial rule. It laid to bear the fact that the imperial rule wasn't the harbinger of modernity that they were talking about. The colonial rule, the imperialists were after all imperialists. Their agenda lay somewhere else and not as a harbinger of modernity and progressive ideals to the Indian woman. It was not the Britishers but the Indian women themselves who organized, and by this time had succeeded in the passage of the Sarda Act. Such was the support for the act even from the nationalist patriarchy group that the bill had to be passed in the Legislative Assembly. So Sarda Act becomes that icon of Indian liberal feminism during this period. It was the most telling blow to Mayo's Mother India, because the agency of change lay not in the imperialism. The agency of change lay in the hands of the Indian liberal feminists themselves. So what happened then is, liberal feminists, they provided this ideological tool for the reconstitution of the Indian nationalist project during this whole period. What do I mean by the reconstitution? I mean the power of liberal feminism was now very, very clear. The power of liberal feminists in the Indian national movement after the Sarda Act was clear. Women would play a very active and defiant role in the Indian freedom struggle post this moment. They were not to be taken lightly, and this was realized by the Indian national movement. So the Indian nationalist project now had an added advantage. Liberal feminism was here to stay, and they provided the new ideological tool for the Indian independence movement from here on. This was the discourse of this Indian feminism. Then went on to provide this alternative to cultural nationalist invocation of a golden age. So this was an answer to that golden age conundrum that we am talking in the past to justify certain limited reforms for women. So when the Indian nationalists were talking about, in the Indian nationalists there was these two parts, the conservatives and the liberals. So the conservatives would always talk about the role of Indian women in the glorious golden past. These people were now answered by this liberal feminists through Sarda Act. This was an alternative nationalist, cultural nationalist policy. This was an alternative. So in the ages to come after it, in the years to come after by, the nationalist question in India was not in isolation from the women's question. The women's question, the liberal feminists were very active role players. They provided the ideological truth. They provided the alternative cultural nationalism to the dominant male Indian nationalism. So this is what would then construct the image of the future Mother India. Now this is where I would like to bring to you the concept of the movie itself. I would not like to go into the whole story of what Indian liberal feminists, that you can of course go and refer to your gender classes. But Indian liberal feminists and their response to Catherine Mayo's Mother India forms a very important premise, forms a very important trajectory in the way in which the Indian national movement takes from here on. This, for me, forms the crux of the whole Indian feminist question. So, the sacred Indian mother, the imagination of the sacred Indian mother had its own tumultuous journey that we see now. It's not a very goody-goody nationalist veneration of a motherhood that we are talking about. The Indian Mother India has its own struggles, right from the partition of Bengal to the Catherine Mayo's Mother India. So, in all of this, we see a slow and steady political coming of age of the Indian women, the Indian women's question. In the process, the Indian freedom struggle, the Indian nationalist discourse narrative also undergoes radical changes. This is what is Mother India's contribution to the question of India, to the idea of the free India later on, because it is the alternative ideological tool which also answers the imperialist question. The imperialist question was given the radical answer. Now, when we come to the movie Mother India, which will be my next class, and before which I will also request all of you to please go and watch the movie first. The question of Mother India then in the movie has to be seen in this context, has to be seen in the context of the Indian liberal feminists coming of age, the Indian liberal feminist undergoing this transformation from being a venerated image to being the image of a fighter woman, to being the image of the woman who brings about a change, a doer, who contributes to the question of India alongside the dominant male patriarchy, who answers the question of the Indian nationalist movement in her own unique way. In the movie, see, it's very easy to confuse the idea of a strong woman with the question of Mother India the movie. In the Mother India the movie, we see a strong woman, but the strong woman is not without history. Her history lies in the context of the larger issue of the veneration of the Mother India and the larger context of the Indian nationalist movement. So the Indian nationalist movement in its earlier years, the Indian, after the freedom, in the early years of the Indian state, the construction of the Indian state, the women's question becomes very pertinent in solving a lot of issues that was faced by the young Indian state. Now this is very important for all of you to understand that the question of women becomes central to the idea of Nehruvian India. So Nehruvian imagination, and Nehru, if you remember, formed part of that liberal male nationalists. Nehru realized the role of the Indian female, and he put into perspective that concept of the Indian female in the larger Indian state, and Mother India is an ode to that vision. Mother India could be called an ode to the Nehruvian vision of the Indian state, wherein the question of the Indian woman and her emancipation and her realities, of course, are central to the idea of this new nation state. Thank you. I'll finish my class with this premise of the concept of Mother India. I would urge all of you to go back and watch the movie Mother India, and of course, I will supply you. I'll give you the study materials for this class. Uh, Thank you. Have a good day.